Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Stop the Press. I'm Rob Chadwick and with me are Nick Copson and Bill Martin, both with a long history of working for local newspapers in the Southwest. Today's episode is recorded on December 16, 2024, and we'll be tackling the BBC and scandals over the last year or more. That took me by surprise, the theme tune stopping there. To give some context, the last 2 weeks of headlines have evolved around Greg Wallace and his behaviour on the set of MasterChef. So how's it going then, people? What have we been up to over the last week since the last episode?
Well, I've got a ridiculous hangover. It was my Christmas party last night, so I'm struggling here, guys. But you got me on, not on top form, but close to it.
Oh, well, you've ahead of me. I'm building up to the Christmas party.
And I've still got another week of work to go, which just feels like a marathon. It's the longest term ever. It's been 15 weeks of students, and I cannot wait for 2 weeks off at Christmas. Still 1 week to go there. Mm-hmm. So just to let people know, this will be our last episode, our 5th episode, until kind of mid to late January, because our esteemed Bill Martin is going away on holiday.
I am.
Lovely, to the Caribbean.
Cruising,
nice. I thought just old people. I still can't get my head around it. It's like I thought just old people went cruising. Are you cruising around the Caribbean?
Have you seen the colour of my hair?
Yeah, well, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Anyway, to the matter in hand. So BBC coverage has focused on all the allegations and put them in the spotlight. It feels like the BBC cover things that happen to them in much more detail than they cover, than any other news organisation covers it. What I was interested in what you guys thought about how the BBC covers the scandals, and I'm thinking of Hugh Edwards, and I'm thinking of Russell Brand, and I'm thinking of Greg Wallace, and before that, I guess I'm thinking of Savile, etc. Why does the BBC go quite so much to town when other organisations possibly don't?
Well, with Greg Wallace and Hugh Edwards, quite simply because it's a big story. I mean, they are massive stories, and like it or not, Hugh Edwards and Greg Wallace are big stars. And both of them are beamed into our living rooms. And I know you're a big fan of MasterChef, Rob. But a lot of people are. So, people are very, very fit. I mean, these are important people in people's lives. So when these stories come out, they are big stories, and they absolutely have to report it in the way that they do. Some people, I think that BBC has been a bit self-flagellating itself. I don't think that's the case at all. I think they're doing a proper job on what is a big story. And they need to be squeaky clean when they're reporting it, because the implications of them not doing it properly are, frankly, quite embarrassing.
So they're always in the spotlight for bias, aren't they, the BBC? So we think that, because I'm one of those who thinks that it is a bit over the top sometimes, and they're a bit opus dei about it. But you think that maybe the BBC have to do it in order to avoid the allegation that they're trying to cover stuff up?
I think that's part of it. I mean, it's easy to say, isn't it? There's a war in Ukraine, there's disaster here, there's disaster there, there's climate change. Clearly, all are much bigger issues.
And yet, Greg Wallace is the lead story for a week.
Has been the lead story for a week, yeah. Or certainly the second or third. And we've, had, each person that comes forward with another allegation about what Greg said or what Greg did or whether he made them feel uncomfortable. It becomes another big story. Unfortunately, you get the news, that I guarantee you that will be one of the best read stories on all websites, and it'll be the one that most people are talking about. That's just the way it is, in terms of what interests, readers or viewers or watchers, whatever it is. And, certainly in my experience over the last 3 weeks, I have, the only thing in the news people have spoken to me about has been Greg Wallace.
Wow. What do you think, Nick?
Well, I've barely looked at it, to be honest, because I've got zero interest in Greg Wallace. But I'd agree with you. I mean, it's clearly on the news agenda, whether I like it or not, and the BBC have to trust their own news instincts and deliver something that reports on what's happening and clearly what people are talking about. However, I do believe there is a little bit of, or maybe a lot of, because it's in their own backyard and because it's one of their own, they have to almost do the exact opposite of brushing it under the carpet. They have to prove their impartiality and to deliver something that perhaps even overexposes what has actually happened. Then they'll be very conscious, and their bosses will be very conscious, right from the top of the organisation through to HR channels, that there'll be a big spotlight on them, and they've got to be seen in some quarters to be putting a magnifying glass on that. Yeah.
So if we take as read that they've got to do that, then what's the problem with the BBC? Why do we get time after time these scandals coming up? Is it just about stars who can't stop using the power dynamic to take advantage of other people, or is there a problem that within the BBC this type of thing is almost encouraged because no one puts a stop to it because they're the talent?
I don't think it's necessarily a problem that exists only within the BBC. I think it exists wherever there are powerful people. There'll be no end of similar stories in corporate organisations all over the world. Poor old BBC. Their problem is that they are a media organisation. It's very high profile, and the chief executive of one of the biggest mining companies and whatever might be much worse than Greg Wallace, and that will get reported, but no one will bat an eyelid about those allegations. The fact that it's Greg Wallace goes back to my point is he is a star. He's a star in the UK. I'm pretty sure it's not a big story in the US, by the way.
No, indeed. And I guess if you look at other industries, if they're in the spotlight, then it does become a big story. So, for instance, this summer we had the Chris Horner stuff from Red Bull Racing and stuff, didn't we? Which that all came out this summer, and it was again main news. It's the public. It's the public again, appetite for tittle tattle, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But again, that the Horner stuff only became big because it's Formula One, and he's married to a Spice Girl.
Yeah,
if you took Jerry out of that, I bet it would barely have made the news.
Yeah, I don't think it's about BBC. I think the worrying thing for me is that if we're talking about news here and the fact that how the BBC have reported their own employee, I guess, isn't it, Greg Wallace? I think he is employed by the BBC. He's not a freelancer, is he?
Well, MasterChef is made by an external production company, so it's not directly the BBC, but they commission it.
Yeah. Well, however it's done, I think the worrying thing is that the BBC only report, and whether it's Hugh Edwards or Russell Brown, I think Jermaine Ginas was I think he was sacked essentially last year for inappropriate comments or behaviour by the BBC, and I think, but they only report on it essentially after the horse has already bolted, right? So after allegations have been brought forward, after investigations have been carried out, then the BBC are heavily reporting it. Maybe this is a bit of a conspiracy theorist view, but I'm struggling to believe that proper news people in the BBC would be unaware of the behaviour of some of the people working at the BBC, but they were not leading that, let's say, that investigative reporting.
So they're not being as rigorous with their journalism as they could be in the beginning, which could actually save a lot of trouble down the line.
It feels more covering their own backs than exposing, breaking a story, basically.
Everyone seemed to know about Savile a long way in advance of Savile even dying, let alone the story breaking.
Well, I mean, Jimmy, the Savile thing has set the tone for any allegations, or even remotely, and I'm not saying Greg Wallace is really similar and that sort of thing, because they're clearly not, but you know what I'm saying, that the spectre of Savile, when clearly dozens, possibly hundreds, depending on who you believe and that sort of thing, people knew about Jimmy Savile and nothing was done, or certainly knew there was something not quite right about some of the things that were happening, And we're all of that generation. We'll all remember what sort of figure in the UK Jimmy Savile was. He was a hero, wasn't he? He almost had direct access to the governments, the Buckingham Palace. He wanted.
Everything.
Yeah. And
that always seemed really odd to me. It's like he just seemed like a creepy old man.
Oh, when you look back now, hindsight's a beautiful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, but even at the time, I thought, I was never a Jimmy Savile fan. It was like,
you can see it now. I bet you wrote in.
We were all very naive.
I bet you asked him to fix it.
I wanted to play tennis with Bjorn Borg and Roscoe Tanner.
There you go. There you go. But that overshadows the reporting and the sort of culture around any allegations, doesn't it? Particularly in the BBC now, because obviously he was such a major BBC figure. But I disagree with you, Nick. I think it's difficult. It's not reporters or the news organisations reporting of Hugh Edwards, for example, that was at fault there, was it? It was that's corporate that's HR. I can get my revenge on HR. That's HR's fault. Do you know what I mean? What were they doing? But it may not even have been their fault, because if nobody has made an allegation, and quite often in all these cases, people are always saying, "Well, why didn't you say something at the time?" or that sort of thing. And sometimes it's years, and then you get into this whole he said, I said. Issues of consent and what people can remember. It's a really difficult area to go into. And I think if you go back to the Russell Brand story, that broke as a result of journalists investigating allegations, quite different from Greg Wallace, I think, which came from direct complaints. So on this occasion, I don't think you can blame the journalists. I think, and back to your original question, Rob, what's wrong with the BBC? I think it's a big organisation with some very high-profile people in it, and I think you mentioned the power dynamic. There are some people who are clearly very powerful, but that's the nature of media organisations, isn't it? You'll get it with actors. You'll have movie stars, rock stars. They have power.
Yeah,
they have power, which means that people around them tend to tolerate things that might not normally be tolerated in other walks of life. And maybe they would. Who knows? Because you get power in all sorts of areas, don't you? But certainly, celebrities and superstars and very high profile figures have that sort of power that people almost don't want to question.
People are attracted to people with power as well, though. So when you start saying the power dynamic shouldn't be abused like that, equally people like people in power and get attracted to them in a physical, sexual way, don't they? So what is the difference between someone being attracted to someone as the power because they're powerful and someone using that power to attract people or etc.? Do you see what I mean? It's almost two sides of the same coin. Forever and a day, people have been into people with power.
And it's down to responsible use of it, isn't it?
It is, and I think what you're saying there is, clearly Savile, Brand, they've certainly Savile and Brand, they've clearly abused their position of power.
Allegedly.
I think we'd better say allegedly.
Allegedly, yes. But
in Latter's case,
they allegedly have.
We haven't got any money. You can't sue us.
But there's been alleged abuse of power there. Right, there we go. Right, but so does that make the position that we put them on, the pedestal they put them in a bad thing, or are they just inherently bad people? Well, probably in Savile's case, yes.
So is it the entertainment industry indulging those people to such a degree that they think they can get away with so much?
100%.
In Savile's case, yes.
That's not necessarily the entertainment industry, is it? That's it's all of us, isn't it? You can see it. There's any number of rock stars. You look back to the heady days of the late 60s and the early 70s, and we all look back at weren't those brilliant days? But once you look into the detail now of some of the recollections and memoirs of groupies from those times, that thing, some of it's a bit grim.
It is.
I think some of the groupies, were
young,
not very old.
Yeah.
And it all becomes a bit distasteful and uncomfortable. So these sort of legendary rock stars, some of my heroes, I look at slightly differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So, have we become a society where workplace interaction, and I think we're getting away from journalism a little bit here, but workplace interaction that isn't totally sanitised runs the risk of being hauled up in front of HR?
Yes.
Or reported on the BBC on the front page if it's in the news.
Yes,
if it's
we
a
have.
famous person?
Yes, we have. Is that a bad thing?
Because it feels like a bad thing to me.
It feels like we've gone too far to the opposite way, right? If we take, I don't know what you call it.
Don't say banter.
No, well, I couldn't find another word for it, unfortunately. Right, a word that sounds like banter, right? That might mean something similar. If we look at that as an extreme we don't want to be part of, we've gone far too far the other way, the polar opposite of that. I feel. So I don't think we can say it's a bad thing, but I feel we've gone too far at the moment.
Yeah, it feels like any sort of joke in a workplace environment could be misconstrued, and you could end up being hauled up in front of HR these days.
Yeah, and also we also don't know what we're likely to get hauled up for. Right?
No.
So therefore we are too reserved. I become that. I'm afraid to say something or voice something for fear of being shot down.
Yeah. And it feels like Greg Wallace, coming back to what we were talking about, kind of was from that background where that stuff just happened, and he was employed by the BBC to be a working class voice because they were aware they were a bunch of middle class people who were university educated, etc., and they wanted someone who could bring a different sort of feel and sound to their programmes. And then he stepped slightly too far over the line, and they've lost their mind about it. Didn't they employ him to do that stuff?
No, I don't think they did, no. I think, I mean, you're into... I agree with you both.
I'm playing devil's advocate here, by the way.
I agree with you both that we've moved into a world now where it is risky to crack a joke, and certainly some of the things that used to be said when I first went into a newsroom all those years ago wouldn't be said now. But having said that, and I've looked at the Wallace allegations, almost said in some detail now, I haven't really, but I've read them all. I've read nearly everything that's been written about it and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure that even in the newsrooms that I first went to in the 1980s, some of the things he said and done just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
So I think he's crossed, in my opinion, he's crossed a line, if what we're being told is true. Then there's all sorts of issues then around, why it took so long for people to pipe up, et cetera, et cetera. But it comes back to that, sort of organisational environment, doesn't it? That when you have big characters that are allowed to get away with things, not necessarily by individuals, but by the structure around them and things like that, then it's almost a recipe for disaster, isn't it? Because, and you can see it. I mean, I listened to a phone-in the other day, a BBC phone-in in the morning. Nicky Campbell, he put it out to the public. There was phone call after phone call saying, "Oh, I met Greg Wallace once, and guess what happened?" It was an absolute pile-on, and you think, "Oh dear."
Yeah. Well, there's a bit of a mob mentality around some of this stuff as well these days. Everyone just jumps in, don't they?
Yeah, I was going to come to that and say, are we running the risk? Yes. So if we accept that Greg Wallace stepped over the line, but are we running the risk that these things come up because someone happens to say something on Twitter or on social media, and then suddenly it explodes out of everywhere? I think back to when the 70s stuff was going on with the Operation U-Tree, and as a reaction to Jimmy Savile, and you had helicopters above Cliff Richard's place being reporting live from the police turning up to arrest Cliff Richard. And it just feels like that sort of lynch mob mentality is coming back into society as a result of this, as a result of you're not allowed to say or do or think or anything that goes outside the liberal norm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Greg Wallace, whether he deserves a chance or not, I don't know. But he hasn't got a chance. I mean, he has been judged now, and he's done. Right, that's it. Now he's done. There might be a room for him somewhere in the future in some other media outlet somehow, but in terms of his mainstream career, he's done.
Big Brother in about 10 years.
Exactly. But I'm not saying there's any kind of detail we need to look into with Greg Wallace. I don't know enough about it really, right? But there's a complete lack of nuance here. He's just gone. He's been summoned before the court of public opinion, and he's been judged and sentenced, and he's gone.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, they can keep reporting it, and the more stuff might come out. But, as far as anyone is concerned, he is guilty, and it's done.
Any allegation nowadays is almost a proof of guilt.
Correct. Yeah.
It's like the no smoke without fire is 10 times, 100 times microscoped nowadays as a result of social media, basically. And that's kind of feeds back to what we were talking about in the last episode.
And I suspect nothing he's done is going to lead to any further action or, any involvement of the police or anything like that. So
He's made some people feel uncomfortable.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
When you actually say it out loud like that,
Yeah.
it's like, you haven't got a right not to be uncomfortable in your life.
We don't like what he's done. Clearly, lots of
Yeah.
people don't like what he's done. But has he done anything illegal? Sounds like not.
I'm happy for him to leave MasterChef. I actually do watch MasterChef, and he's terrible on it. But on as a side note, I'm
That's
more
it.
than happy
He's
for him to
definitely
go.
done.
I always wondered, how has he even become famous in the first place? But
Gurning at the camera
Yeah,
and mumbling
exactly.
platitudes, basically. So I'm happy he's gone. But, it just feels like almost a pretext to say, right, okay, the BBC kind of say, look at us, look how clean living we are, really. And we police ourselves really well and all of that type of stuff. And it doesn't feel like they really are policing themselves really well. And they pick on this person and that person and that person. There's probably 20 of them behind that who are still getting away with it because they're a bit too important to the organisation to take to task at the moment.
Well, there's all that hoo-ha about Gary Lineker's
Online content.
he was posting on Twitter, wasn't he? Or
Yeah.
X is now his views about certain issues and things like that. And he nearly got sacked over that,
Yeah.
which, is a whole other question, isn't it? It makes you think.
Well, they're supposed to be impartial. So if their journalists are on Twitter being impartial, it is a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah, except he's a football presenter.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's one of the biggest names in town, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, might get it.
Paid a lot of money. Anyway, onwards. So what are the next steps for the BBC? You two have worked in a media organisation, a big media organisation. If this situation was put in front of you two, what would be your next steps? What would you do to try and mend the reputation of the organisation and move forward in a way where people aren't going to be just waiting for the next BBC scandal to break?
Well, I mean, you're into management organisation, really. There, aren't you? I mean, it's a cultural shift that needs to take place. I guess. I've never worked, been involved in MasterChef or something like that. But everywhere I've worked, there's been an environment that would moderate that sort of behaviour. Do you know what I mean? And if people stepped over the line, I've seen people do it, they'd get called out, either by management or more often than not by their colleagues, who'd say, "Oh, you can't do that." That's not always been easy. Sometimes it's been very difficult. But that's a cultural thing, I think. I think that the difficulty is when you've got these big, powerful beasts, and they're powerful people, aren't they? Whether that's Edwards, whether that's Wallace, whether that's whoever. People are, whether afraid or they're reluctant to call them out because they probably depend on them for their living. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're part of a good thing. If you work on MasterChef, the last thing you want to do is call out the big star.
Yeah, if you're back room staff, that's a pretty good job, I'd imagine. Yeah.
So the challenge there is for management, isn't it? That sounds really dull, but I mean, to create these cultural environments where behaviour is acceptable.
Yeah.
Is the challenge for them.
I've never worked in television, but my understanding of television is that ratings are the single most important currency for them. And I imagine that overpowers any kind of, HR-related discussions. I've refused to believe that I don't want to put it back to HR. I refuse to believe that the power brokers at the BBC knew nothing about some of their individuals working for them. that we've discussed in this podcast. I refuse to. But I think their lesson they need to move forward with is now if they to essentially clear their decks, look into the annals of their corridors and go, have we got anyone who's not toeing the line? And if we have, move them on, regardless of what the ratings might happen with that, or even break the bloody story themselves.
Yeah. A bit more investigative reporting by people within the BBC on themselves, possibly, yeah. But as Bill said earlier, it is probably most organisations anyway, I'd imagine.
Yes.
Okay, so I think that's us explored that very well. We'll be back after Christmas. What are we all doing for Christmas, everybody?
Eating turkey.
Drinking
lots, yeah. And I'll be doing probably not the
yoga.
Turkey, but it won't be yoga. Probably not the turkey, but certainly plenty of eating, as my waistline would suggest. We will see you in late January. Hope you have a good Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.